Some narratives remain imprisoned within us, as though secured by multiple locks. Certain recollections carry such weight that we bear them through decades before mustering the fortitude to voice them. Yet today, after countless seasons, I sense the appropriate moment has finally arrived. For no child should endure formative years in an environment devoid of affection.
I want to pause for a moment. If you feel the love and are still listening to my story, please subscribe and hit the like button on the Grandparents Memories channel to show your support. Thank you so much.
I am Abigail Abby Winters, currently 79, a tranquil individual who has discovered appreciation for life's modest pleasures. This equilibrium, however, wasn't my constant companion. My childhood experiences surpass what many can conceive as reality. I was raised where dread established permanent residency, where unuttered words communicated more profoundly than articulated ones, and where each sunrise initiated an invisible conflict waged without observers. Pennsylvania's rural landscape welcomed my arrival in 1945, a community of unpaved thoroughfares and modest dwellings where neighborly recognition was universal. External perceptions suggested normalcy: an industrious father, a committed mother, two neatly attired children attending school daily. Yet behind our doors, an entirely contrary existence unfolded. My younger brother Nate, and I comprehended prematurely that our upbringing diverged significantly from our peers, not through exceptional privilege, but through the aberrant sculpting influence of persistent apprehension. Robert Bob Winters, my father, commanded community respect, imposing in stature, perpetually well-groomed with penetrating eyes. His automotive repair business positioned him as a fixture in local commerce. Within his establishment, he projected conviviality toward patrons, occasionally waiving fees for neighbors' repairs, and exchanged pleasantries with passing youngsters. Domestically, however, he transformed into a taciturn figure with an inscrutable countenance. On those occasions when he broke silence, his utterances descended with crushing gravity. My mother, Evelyn Winters, possessed delicate beauty that appeared progressively diminished through passing years. Authentic smiles remain absent from my recollections of her. Her infrequent amusement manifested as hesitant and constrained, suggesting trepidation toward experiencing excessive happiness. Professionally inactive beyond our residence, her existence hinged entirely upon my father's garage earnings. This dependency rendered her choiceless, freedomless, voiceless. At school, I envied the other children. I heard my classmates talk about their parents with affection, telling how they were spoiled, how they received gifts, or how they spent afternoons playing in the yard. I would just lower my head and pretend to be distracted. Nobody could know how things were at home. What happened inside our house stayed inside our house. That's what my mother always said. On Sundays, my mother took us to Grace Methodist Church. It was one of the few moments when we felt free. I liked seeing the church full, the organ music and choir singing that mixed with the perfume of the ladies who sat in the front rows. Nate liked to sing the hymns, and I liked seeing him smile. Inside the church, we felt that for a few hours we were like any other children, but as soon as the service ended, we returned home and put our masks back on. Our father didn't like us going out much. He said the world out there was dangerous, that people were fake, that the town was full of gossips. He liked to keep the family under his watch. Our house had large windows, but the curtains were always closed. From the outside, no one could imagine what was happening in there. I grew up not knowing what affection was. I never heard "I love you." I never received a spontaneous hug from my father. My mother was more affectionate, but always in a discreet way, as if afraid to show too much. Nate, on the other hand, always sought the love that never came. He was more sensitive, more vulnerable, and perhaps because of this, he carried the heaviest burdens. Nights were always the worst. When the sun set, we felt that the day wasn't over for us yet. The silence of the house was interrupted only by the sound of the front door opening and our father's shoes on the maple wood floors. My brother would curl up in bed, and I would press my hands against my ears, hoping the night would pass quickly. Over time, I learned to close myself off, to pretend nothing affected me. My brother, however, couldn't hide the fear in his eyes. I remember once, when I was about 9 years old, Nate came to me holding a broken toy, a toy truck that he adored. He held the little pieces as if trying to fix something beyond repair. I wanted to tell him everything would be okay, but in that house, such promises were empty. It was around this time that I realized our life couldn't continue this way forever. Something inside me said that one day all this would have to end. I didn't know when or how, but I knew that one day fear would have to give way to courage. Some people are like storms. You never know when they'll arrive or what damage they'll leave behind. You just learn to protect yourself. And I learned too early. My father, Robert Bob Winters, was a man of presence, tall, broad-shouldered, with always well-combed hair and a gaze that revealed nothing. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice carried the weight of a sentence. He was the type of person no one dared contradict, who needed just one word for the entire house to fall silent. He didn't need to raise his voice to command respect. His presence was enough to make my mother lower her eyes and my brother shrink his shoulders. In small-town Pennsylvania in the 1950s, men like him were common. Rigid family heads, tireless workers, owners of their homes and their families. Respect was earned through fear, not love. But what the neighbors saw was a respectable mechanic who offered free repairs to the poorest and who participated in town festivals as if he were a generous man. No one knew that inside the house, the man we called father was a stranger to us. I don't know at what moment I realized my father wasn't like other children's fathers. Perhaps it was when I started going to school and heard other girls talk about how their fathers picked them up, how they played in the yard, how they brought sweets from town. I never had any of that. My father didn't know my favorite dessert. He didn't know if I preferred dolls or drawing. He knew nothing about me and perhaps didn't want to know. When he came home after work, he followed the same ritual. He would place his newsboy cap on the hook near the door, take off his shoes, sit in his favorite chair, and wait for my mother to serve the meatloaf with mashed potatoes. He didn't ask how our day was. He didn't want to know about our grades at school. He just waited, like a king expecting to be served. My mother, Evelyn, was always attentive. She knew the exact time to serve dinner, to fold his clothes, to avoid unnecessary conversations. She was a beautiful woman, but one who seemed to have faded over time. Her smile, when it appeared, was restrained, discreet, as if the world had taught her that too much happiness could be dangerous. Nate and I learned to be invisible. We didn't make noise. We didn't run inside the house, didn't question anything. But my brother was different from me. While I learned to hide in silence, he still tried to approach our father. He tried to start conversations, show a drawing, talk about school, but he never received a response, just a vague look, an indifferent nod. There was something in my father's manner that I didn't understand at that age, but which today, so many years later, I see clearly. He didn't see his family as something he loved. He saw my mother as someone who owed him obedience. He saw the house as a space where he commanded, and he saw us, the children, as mere details in his life. I knew he didn't see us as children. To him, we weren't small beings in formation, full of dreams and fragilities. We were just part of the house, like furniture, like an object that doesn't move without permission. I remember one specific day. Nate was 7, I was 9. My brother adored birds. At that time, many people had cages hanging in their yards with canaries that sang in the morning. But Nate didn't want a cage bird. He wanted to care for one, let it be free. One day, he found an injured robin bird near the road, picked it up carefully, and brought it home hidden between his hands. He put it in a shoebox with an old cloth and a saucer of water. "It will get better," he whispered to me that night, his eyes shining with hope. But what my brother didn't know was that our father didn't like anything that hadn't been decided by him. And when he saw the shoebox in the corner of the room, everything changed. What happened after that night was etched in my mind for years, but I don't need to tell it. I can only say that the next day, Nate spoke less, looked up less, as if something inside him had gone out. It was at that moment that I began to understand that inside that house, we couldn't have our own wills, couldn't show weakness, attachment, or dreams. My father didn't want us happy. He wanted us to be like him, hard, silent, without emotions. I quickly learned to hide who I was. My brother, not so much. And perhaps because of this, as the years passed, he was the most affected by everything we lived through. My father continued to be the same respected man in town, continued to shake customers' hands at the garage, continued to participate in religious festivals, continued to be seen as a good provider. But inside the house, he was just a heavy shadow that suffocated everything around him. I knew that one day something would have to change. I just didn't know how. Each person carries pain in their own way. Some fall silent, others revolt, but no one passes unscathed when they grow up in a home where love never existed. My brother and I were always very different. Nate was born with a sweet heart. From an early age, he saw beauty in the simplest things. He liked to watch the sunset, follow ants carrying leaves, listen to the stories of older neighbors when they sat in front of their houses to sew. He was easily enchanted and therefore easily hurt as well. As for me, from an early age, I learned that the best way to survive was by closing myself off. I didn't cry, didn't ask for anything, didn't show emotions. Nate was the opposite. He always tried to get close to our father, tried to make conversation at dinner, show his drawings from school, ask about things he read in books. But our father never showed interest. At most, an impatient look, a sigh before turning away. My brother was still too young to understand what that meant, but I understood. I understood that love didn't live in that house. Even so, Nate didn't give up. He believed that if he tried hard enough, one day he would receive a gesture of affection. But that day never came. I grew up hearing insults, harsh words, feeling like a burden in my own home. But Nate carried another type of suffering, the kind that makes someone question if they deserve to be there, if they deserve to be part of the family, if they deserve to exist. And that was even worse. My brother had a dream. He wanted to be a teacher. From an early age, he was enchanted by school books. At that time, in small-town Pennsylvania, not everyone could study for very long. Most children, especially boys, stopped after a few years to help their parents with work. But Nate wanted more. He said he wanted to teach, that he wanted a different future. I remember well the day he told this to our father. It was a hot afternoon, and we were sitting on the porch of the house. Nate looked at the horizon with eyes shining with hope. "Dad, someday I want to be a teacher." Our father turned to him slowly, as if he had just heard the most absurd thing in the world. "Teacher, that doesn't give you a future, boy. A respectable man works." Nate lowered his head. I saw his fingers tightening on the hem of his shorts, a sign of nervousness he always had. But unlike me, he didn't know how to swallow his words. "But Dad, teaching is work." The silence that followed this phrase was heavy. Our mother looked down, pretending not to have heard. I, sitting beside them, held my breath. I knew that insisting on that was dangerous. My father stood up, adjusted his belt, and looked Nate up and down. "Stop this nonsense. You're not going to be a teacher. Nothing of the sort." Nate didn't say anything else, but that night, when we went to bed, he lay facing the wall, his eyes watery. I knew that something inside him had broken and would never be fixed. My brother always had a light heart, but over time, I noticed he was changing. Gradually, he became more quiet, more introspective. He no longer tried to make conversation with our father, no longer drew with such enthusiasm. Something inside him was going out. Once, he called me to the backyard and showed me an old cage he had found thrown behind our father's garage. "I'm going to fix it up," he said, with a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "And what will you put inside?" I asked. He smiled, but it was a sad smile. "Nothing. I just want to leave the door open." At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. Only much later did I realize that cage was a metaphor. Nate felt trapped, suffocated inside that house. But unlike me, who learned to survive by hardening, he still dreamed of freedom, still believed that one day he could fly. Over time, I got used to our reality. I would wake up, do my chores, help my mother, go to school, come back, stay silent. I learned to accept that our father was the way he was, and that nothing would change that. But Nate never accepted. He tried to find small refuges. He liked to read in hiding. He liked to spend time alone, drawing dreams in the dirt. But the sadness began to become stronger than him, until the day came when he simply gave up, not on life, but on trying to fit into that house. He stopped talking, stopped trying to please our father, stopped dreaming out loud. I saw the light in his eyes going out a little more each day, and that hurt me more than any word I had ever heard inside that house. One night, we were sitting on the floor of our room, Nate looking at the stars through the window. He seemed distant, as if his mind were somewhere else. "Do you think we'll ever get out of here?" he asked. I took a while to respond. I didn't want to give hope, but I also didn't want to take away what little remained inside him. "I think so," I answered after a long silence. He smiled slightly, but his gaze still carried immense sadness. "If we get out, promise me one thing." "What?" He looked at me, his eyes more serious than I had ever seen. "That we'll never let anyone treat us like this again." I held his hand. "I promise." It was at that moment that I realized we needed to get out of there, that somehow this story had to change, and that as great as the fear was, courage needed to be greater. Not all prisons have bars. Some are made of words, of glances, of years of silence.
I want to pause for a moment. If you feel the love and are still listening to my story, please subscribe and hit the like button on the Grandparents Memories channel to show your support. Thank you so much.
He was easily enchanted and therefore easily hurt as well. As for me, from an early age, I learned that the best way to survive was by closing myself off. I didn't cry, didn't ask for anything, didn't show emotions. Nate was the opposite. He always tried to get close to our father, tried to make conversation at dinner, show his drawings from school, ask about things he read in books. But our father never showed interest. At most, an impatient look, a sigh before turning away. My brother was still too young to understand what that meant, but I understood. I understood that love didn't live in that house. Even so, Nate didn't give up. He believed that if he tried hard enough, one day he would receive a gesture of affection. But that day never came. I grew up hearing insults, harsh words, feeling like a burden in my own home. But Nate carried another type of suffering, the kind that makes someone question if they deserve to be there, if they deserve to be part of the family, if they deserve to exist. And that was even worse. My brother had a dream. He wanted to be a teacher. From an early age, he was enchanted by school books. At that time, in small-town Pennsylvania, not everyone could study for very long. Most children, especially boys, stopped after a few years to help their parents with work. But Nate wanted more. He said he wanted to teach, that he wanted a different future. I remember well the day he told this to our father. It was a hot afternoon, and we were sitting on the porch of the house. Nate looked at the horizon with eyes shining with hope. "Dad, someday I want to be a teacher." Our father turned to him slowly, as if he had just heard the most absurd thing in the world. "Teacher, that doesn't give you a future, boy. A respectable man works." Nate lowered his head. I saw his fingers tightening on the hem of his shorts, a sign of nervousness he always had. But unlike me, he didn't know how to swallow his words. "But Dad, teaching is work." The silence that followed this phrase was heavy. Our mother looked down, pretending not to have heard. I, sitting beside them, held my breath. I knew that insisting on that was dangerous. My father stood up, adjusted his belt, and looked Nate up and down. "Stop this nonsense. You're not going to be a teacher. Nothing of the sort." Nate didn't say anything else, but that night, when we went to bed, he lay facing the wall, his eyes watery. I knew that something inside him had broken and would never be fixed. My brother always had a light heart, but over time, I noticed he was changing. Gradually, he became more quiet, more introspective. He no longer tried to make conversation with our father, no longer drew with such enthusiasm. Something inside him was going out. Once, he called me to the backyard and showed me an old cage he had found thrown behind our father's garage. "I'm going to fix it up," he said, with a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "And what will you put inside?" I asked. He smiled, but it was a sad smile. "Nothing. I just want to leave the door open." At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. Only much later did I realize that cage was a metaphor. Nate felt trapped, suffocated inside that house. But unlike me, who learned to survive by hardening, he still dreamed of freedom, still believed that one day he could fly. Over time, I got used to our reality. I would wake up, do my chores, help my mother, go to school, come back, stay silent. I learned to accept that our father was the way he was, and that nothing would change that. But Nate never accepted. He tried to find small refuges. He liked to read in hiding. He liked to spend time alone, drawing dreams in the dirt. But the sadness began to become stronger than him, until the day came when he simply gave up, not on life, but on trying to fit into that house. He stopped talking, stopped trying to please our father, stopped dreaming out loud. I saw the light in his eyes going out a little more each day, and that hurt me more than any word I had ever heard inside that house. One night, we were sitting on the floor of our room, Nate looking at the stars through the window. He seemed distant, as if his mind were somewhere else. "Do you think we'll ever get out of here?" he asked. I took a while to respond. I didn't want to give hope, but I also didn't want to take away what little remained inside him. "I think so," I answered after a long silence. He smiled slightly, but his gaze still carried immense sadness. "If we get out, promise me one thing." "What?" He looked at me, his eyes more serious than I had ever seen. "That we'll never let anyone treat us like this again." I held his hand. "I promise." It was at that moment that I realized we needed to get out of there, that somehow this story had to change, and that as great as the fear was, courage needed to be greater. Not all prisons have bars. Some are made of words, of glances, of years of silence. My mother lived inside one of these prisons, and for a long time I thought she would never leave it. My mother, Evelyn Winters, was a woman of few gestures. She walked slowly, spoke softly, and avoided anything that might displease my father. When I was little, I didn't understand why. I thought mothers were like in school books, strong, protective, who picked up their children when they cried and faced anything to defend them. But my mother was different. She seemed to live inside herself, as if there were an invisible wall separating her feelings from the outside world. Over time, I understood that this wall wasn't built because she wanted it. It was erected by fear. In that time, the 1950s, a woman without a husband was nothing. If she didn't have a job or a family to support her, she was condemned to a life of hardship. And my father knew this. He knew my mother had nowhere to go, that she depended on him for food, for clothing, for shelter. And that was the worst form of prison, one that didn't need chains. I grew up watching my mother. I saw how her eyes avoided my father's whenever he came home, saw how her hands trembled slightly when he spoke more seriously. I saw how she was always alert, always attentive, always trying to predict what he wanted, even before he asked. She knew that any wrong word could turn a normal day into a difficult one, and so she never said anything. One thing I'll never forget are the nights. My mother had a habit of sitting on the edge of the bed before sleeping, applying cream to her hands with slow, almost mechanical movements. I watched her through the door crack, waiting for some sign that inside her there was still a woman who dreamed, who wanted something beyond that life, but all I saw was weariness. She wasn't an old woman, but she seemed aged by time, not by wrinkles, not by gray hair, but by her gaze. It was the gaze of someone who had lost all battles before even fighting. I wondered if she remembered who she was before getting married, if she still recalled the dreams she had when she was young. But I think she erased all that, erased it to survive. My mother had a curious way of dealing with things. When she sensed my father was in a bad mood, she did everything to keep the house in a state of absolute calm. She would call us aside and say it was better not to cause trouble. On days when my father came home early from work, she already had dinner ready before he even walked through the door. When he was quieter than normal, she avoided talking about money, about any problems, about anything that might bother him. She had such a deep fear that she began to anticipate. We grow up thinking adults know everything, but over time, I realized my mother was just a frightened girl who never learned to escape. I'll never forget that morning. It was an ordinary day. The sun was shining. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen, and Nate was sitting at the table, drawing on a piece of paper. My mother was washing dishes while my father read the Mill Creek Herald, as he did every morning. Everything was silent until suddenly something broke that silence. My mother stopped what she was doing, dried her hands, and said with the firmest voice I had ever heard come from her, "Robert, I wanted to talk about something." Nate and I looked at each other. My father lowered the newspaper slowly, looked at her without saying anything. My mother took a deep breath. I was thinking that maybe it would be good for me to work. A heavy silence took over the kitchen. My father's face showed no emotion, but I knew that inside him something had been triggered. "Work?" he repeated. My mother clutched the dish towel in her hands. Yes, maybe at Mrs. Parker's library, helping to arrange the shelves, or sewing for others. She spoke quickly, as if trying to finish before he interrupted her. But he didn't interrupt. He just closed the newspaper calmly, placed it on the table, and looked right into her eyes. "And why do you want to work?" My mother hesitated. Just to help here at home." My father was silent for a long time, then smiled at the corner of his mouth. "Help? I give you everything you need, don't I?" My mother lowered her eyes. "Yes, you do." He nodded, satisfied, picked up the newspaper again, opened it, and continued reading. Then stopped talking nonsense. My mother stood there for a few seconds. I saw her heavy breathing, her lost gaze, and then, as if that moment had never happened, she returned to the sink and continued washing the dishes. That day, I understood that my mother would never leave because she didn't even believe she could. After that day, my mother never spoke about working again, never brought up the subject, but something changed inside her. She no longer smiled, not even at the little things. If before there was a remnant of joy in hanging clothes in the sunny yard, in arranging flowers on the table, in seeing Nate sing while drawing, that disappeared. She became even more silent, even more fragile, even more distant, and I realized she had lost the only thing that still remained inside her, hope. That's when I understood that if anything was going to change, it wouldn't be because of my mother. She was already too trapped. If someone needed to take action, it would be Nate and I. And someday, the opportunity would come. After all, no matter how long the storm, the sun would have to rise again. There are pains that time doesn't heal. Some memories don't fade. We just learn to carry them in a way that doesn't prevent us from continuing to walk. But with each step, they're still there. Time passed, but nothing changed inside that house. The days were always the same, the routine unchangeable. Breakfast served at the table, my father reading a newspaper in silence, my mother walking lightly, stepping as if avoiding waking something dangerous inside that man. Nate and I followed the invisible script we had learned since we were small. Don't raise your voice. Don't disagree. Don't show sadness. In small-town Pennsylvania in the 1950s, family life was reduced to work, school, and religion. Women knew their place was inside the house. Men knew their role was to command. And the children, well, the children just learned to repeat this cycle. But Nate and I didn't want to repeat this cycle. We knew from an early age that we were different from other children, not because we had something special, but because fear shaped us in a way that no one should ever be shaped. I closed myself off, became hard, became someone who swallowed tears before they even rose up my throat. Nate, on the other hand, became a broken mirror. He smiled when he needed to smile, spoke when he needed to speak, but inside, I knew he was coming apart, bit by bit. There were moments when he seemed distracted, looking at the horizon as if he were far away from there. I would call him, and he would take time to respond, as if his mind were wandering somewhere else. I didn't know where he went in these moments, but I knew it wasn't a good place. If there was one place where Nate and I could breathe, that place was Mill Creek Elementary School. Our school was simple, with peeling walls and blackboards worn by time. The teachers were strict, and the wooden desks creaked when someone moved, but still, it was a refuge. There, we could just be children. We could laugh softly during classes. We could talk about silly things. We could pretend that at the end of the day, we wouldn't have to go back home. Nate was always a good student. He liked math and history. He liked to draw maps in his notebook and solve difficult problems just for the pleasure of finding the answer. I also liked to study, but for me, school was just a break. For Nate, it was a dream. He wanted more. He wanted a future. But he also knew that for us, future was a luxury. No one in our house talked about tomorrow. There were no plans, no dreams, just days that repeated themselves. And perhaps because of this, Nate began to change even more. Over time, I began to notice that Nate was becoming increasingly distant. Before, he at least tried to talk to me, tried to tell me about his dreams, about the books he read, about what he wanted to do when he grew up. But then he stopped. He would spend long hours in the backyard, sitting under the shade of a tree, drawing things I couldn't understand. Sometimes he drew birds. Other times he drew open doors. I would ask what it meant, but he would just smile slightly and change the subject. Until one day, he looked me in the eyes and said something I'll never forget. If I were a bird, I would fly far away from here. I wanted to say something comforting, but what could I say? I also wanted to fly, but our wings hadn't grown yet. My mother noticed that Nate was different. She didn't say anything, but her looks betrayed her concern. Sometimes she would run her hand through his hair slowly, a rare gesture of affection. Other times, she would sit nearby and try to talk, but he never said much. I think somehow my mother knew we were trapped. She saw in us the same sadness she had carried for years. But unlike us, she had already accepted this fate. Nate and I still had hope, and it was this hope that made us more restless each day. Nate and I never talked about it, but I knew he had a plan. I saw in his eyes that he wanted to escape. Maybe not physically, because we were still children, but somehow he wanted to get away. And maybe that's why he spent so much time drawing. Maybe that's why he looked at the sky so much. I was afraid to ask, afraid that putting it into words would make it too real. But deep down, I knew. I knew that place would never be enough for us, and that one day, something would have to change.
I want to pause for a moment. If you feel the love and are still listening to my story, please subscribe and hit the like button on the Grandparents Memories channel to show your support. Thank you so much.
It was on a warm night that everything became clearer to me. The moon lit up the backyard, and Nate was sitting on the dirt, looking up. I approached slowly and sat beside him. "What are you thinking about?" I asked. He took a while to respond. "That I don't want to be like our father." I remained silent. I don't want to grow up and feel what he feels. I don't want to look at people as if they were small. I don't want to become a bitter man. I took a deep breath. "Then don't become one." He turned his face to me, and at that moment, I felt that this was a silent pact between us. Nate wanted to free himself, and somehow I wanted to as well. The question was how. Childhood leaves marks. Some are visible, like scratches on the knee or scars from falls in the yard. Others are invisible, but much deeper. Nate and I carried these marks. Each imposed silence, each stifled dream. Each night we lay looking at the ceiling, waiting for the storm to pass. And it was there, under the moonlight that night, that I realized time would not heal these wounds. Only we could heal them. Only we could change this story, and at some point, we would do it. There are moments in life that divide our story into a before and an after. When something happens and we know we'll never be the same again. That night, everything changed. I always knew our house wasn't a home. Houses should be places where people felt safe, where you slept without fear, where there was laughter in the hallways. But ours was never like that. We learned to walk in silence, to speak softly, to pretend we didn't exist. We learned to observe the signs, to predict storms before they arrived. But sometimes they came without warning. In that time, the late 1950s, families lived according to a predictable rhythm. The father worked outside, the mother took care of the house, the children obeyed. On our street, each house had its own routine, and all seemed to follow this same order. The difference was that in other houses, the living room lights stayed on late because families talked before going to bed. Mothers sat with their children on the porch to tell stories. Fathers carried the little ones on their laps, showing them the stars. In our house, the light went out early, and in the dark, we learned that silence was our best defense. It was an ordinary day. Nate and I had returned from school, done our homework, dined in silence as always. Our father was quiet, but that wasn't news. He was always silent, as if chewing thoughts he would never share. After dinner, I went to the room. Nate stayed in the backyard, looking at the sky as he did every night. I was already lying down when I heard a strange noise. It wasn't something loud. It wasn't something that broke the silence of the house at once. It was a muffled sound, as if someone were trying to swallow a sob. I got up slowly. My heart was racing because I already knew what that sound meant. I opened the door and saw my mother standing in the hallway with trembling hands looking into Nate's room. That scene never left my head, the way she stood there, as if trapped between the desire to do something and the fear that held her back. The way Nate stood, eyes fixed on the floor. The way the silence inside that house seemed to scream louder than any sound. That night, Nate was even more quiet. I wanted to ask, wanted to know what had happened, wanted to find some way to help him, but I already knew. I didn't need to ask, didn't need to hear anything, because I knew the weight of that look, the weight of someone who understood far too early that the world can be unfair, that some pains cannot be shared, that there are things that simply aren't spoken about. I didn't know what to do. The only thing I managed was to sit beside him in the backyard, in silence, looking at the same stars he so liked to see. And after a while, he finally spoke. "Do you think heaven is a better place?" I swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" He sighed. "Up there. Things must be fairer. People must be happier." That conversation frightened me because for the first time, I realized that Nate didn't just want to escape that house. He wanted to escape everything. After that night, I began to observe Nate even more closely. He was different, more silent than ever, no longer drawing, no longer smiling. It seemed that a part of him had been lost, and I knew that if I did nothing, perhaps he would be lost completely. So, for the first time, I took courage to confront my mother. One afternoon, I entered the kitchen while she was washing dishes. She was distracted and seemed tired, as always. "Mom?" She didn't look at me, just continued scrubbing the plate forcefully. "What is it, Abby?" I took a deep breath. "We need to get out of here." She paused for a second, but then continued washing, as if she hadn't heard. But I knew she had. "Mom, look at Nate. He's not well." She remained silent for so long that I thought she wouldn't respond. But then, in a low voice, she said, "I know." My heart raced. "Then why don't we do something?" She took a deep breath. "Because I can't." I wanted to scream, wanted to say that wasn't true, that there was always a way out. But when I looked into her eyes, I understood. She didn't believe there was. She had already accepted that fate, and if it depended on her, we would never leave. That night, Nate and I sat on the bed and talked like we never had before. We didn't need to say much. We knew what we needed to do. We knew no one would come to save us, and if we wanted to change our destiny, we would have to do it ourselves. It was there, at that moment, that everything changed, because for the first time, we felt something we hadn't felt in years: hope. And it was this hope that would guide us to what would come next. Fear keeps us still. Revolt makes us move. After so long swallowing each pain in silence, we realized that if we wanted to change our destiny, we would have to do it ourselves. The days passed after that conversation, but something inside me had already changed. I wasn't the same anymore. I couldn't be. What was once fear was gradually transforming into revolt. I began to see everything differently. Every detail of that house seemed to scream at me. The sound of the newspaper being folded by my father in the living room, the smell of the cherry cobbler my mother prepared with trembling hands, the sound of Nate's footsteps in the backyard, always slow, always dragging. I had never paid so much attention to these details, but now it was as if I were seeing our life from the outside, as if I could see each piece of this invisible prison that surrounded us. And all this gave me a certainty. We couldn't stay there forever. But leaving that house wasn't so simple. After all, we had nowhere to go. My mother was financially dependent on my father. Nate and I were just two children without money, without anyone who could take us in. So if we wanted to find a way out, we would need to be smart. We would need to act carefully. Nate and I spent weeks thinking about how we could get out of there. It wasn't something we could do just anyway. If we tried to leave without a plan, we would be forced to return, and then everything would be even worse. One day, while we were washing pans in the kitchen, I whispered to my mother, "Have you ever thought about leaving?" She stopped what she was doing for a second, her gaze fixed on the soapy water. "Go where, Abby?" I knew that would be the answer. Even so, I tried to insist. "Do you have any friends, any aunts in another city?" She sighed and continued washing the pans. "Don't talk about this, daughter. This isn't something to think about." But I knew she had thought about it. I knew that every night, when she looked at the ceiling before sleeping, my mother dreamed of a different life. Only she had already accepted that it would never happen. I couldn't accept the same. With my mother unable to act, I realized we would need to seek help elsewhere. The only person I trusted outside the house was Mrs. Gladys Parker, a neighbor who always treated us well. She was a strong woman, a widow who supported her house working at the local library. I waited for an afternoon when she would be alone and went there. "Mrs. Parker," I began nervously, "I wanted to know, have you ever thought about needing to leave home without having anywhere to go?" She frowned, curious. "Why that question, girl?" I bit my lips. I couldn't tell everything. If I said too much, I ran the risk of someone finding out and things getting even worse for us. "Nothing. It's just that sometimes I wish my mother had a place to go, you know." Mrs. Parker looked at me for a while, and then, in a lower tone of voice, said something that made me understand that even outsiders knew about our situation. "Abby, some things in life aren't easy to solve, but never forget, no one deserves to live trapped." I wanted to ask more. I wanted to know if she could help. But before I had the courage, I heard a loud noise coming from our house. My heart raced. Without thinking, I ran out. When I arrived home, I saw my mother sitting on the sofa, hands pressed tightly on her lap. Her gaze was lost. Nate was in the room, lying on the bed, looking at the ceiling. I didn't need to ask. I already knew. I already knew something had happened, that once again, my brother had carried a weight that should never have been his. The revolt inside me grew in a way it had never grown before, and at that moment, I made the decision that would change everything. That night, I sat beside Nate and whispered, "We need to get out of here." He didn't respond immediately, but after a while, he turned his head to look at me. "How?" I swallowed hard. I don't know yet, but we'll find a way. He took a deep breath. I don't know if I can. I held his hand. Yes, you can, and so can I. It was the first time we had spoken about this out loud, and now there was no turning back. In the following days, I began to pay attention to everything: the times my father left and arrived, the keys my mother kept inside the cabinet, the few coins that were kept in the kitchen drawer. We couldn't just leave without a plan, but an opportunity would arise. And when it did, we needed to be ready. It was on a Sunday morning that everything happened. My father left for the garage earlier than normal. My mother was at church. Nate and I were left alone at home. We looked at each other. We didn't need to say anything. We went to the cabinet, took the keys, took the coins, took a bag with some clothes, and then we left without looking back, without fear, without doubt. From that moment on, the fear that had kept us trapped our entire lives was replaced by something else: courage. And this courage would guide us to what would come next. Life has a curious way of settling accounts. Sometimes justice comes quickly, other times it takes longer. But one thing is certain: no one escapes it forever. That Sunday morning, when Nate and I left home without looking back, I felt something I had never felt before: freedom. Even with my heart racing, even without having a completely structured plan, there was inside me a sensation I had never experienced. I felt that for the first time, we owned our story. We walked quickly along the dirt road, not exchanging many words. The sound of our footsteps seemed to echo inside me, as if it were an announcement of what was to come. The world seemed bigger than ever, but at the same time, we knew it wouldn't be gentle with us. I didn't know exactly where we were going, but I knew we couldn't go back anymore, and fate was already taking care of the rest. Our first instinct was to go to Mrs. Parker's house, the neighbor who had always treated us well. I knocked on the door hard, and when she opened it and saw our faces, she didn't need to ask anything. "Come in," she said without hesitation. Her house was small, with the fresh smell of coffee and cherry cobbler. Everything seemed cozy, but my body was so tense that I could hardly feel any comfort. Nate sat at the table, his shoulders hunched, his head down. "What happened?" Mrs. Parker asked, looking fixedly at me. I took a deep breath. "We left home and can't go back." She was silent for a time, then sighed. I knew this day would come. What I didn't know was that my father would discover it too quickly. He came home mid-morning, finding the silence strange, the absence of Nate and me. My mother, anxious, didn't know how to disguise it. He realized something was wrong, and that's how he began to search. In those days, there weren't easily accessible phones, but there were neighbors, acquaintances, people who saw and talked. It didn't take long for him to knock on Mrs. Parker's door. We were inside when we heard the heavy footsteps. The blood froze in my veins. Mrs. Parker looked at us and whispered, "Stay here." She opened the door, and my father didn't even ask permission. "Where are the children?" His tone of voice wasn't loud. He never shouted, but it was the type of voice that made others back away. Mrs. Parker, however, didn't back away. "They're here, but they'll only leave if they want to." The silence between the two was suffocating. I felt Nate squeeze my hand on the table. I didn't want to go out, but I knew that sooner or later this conversation would have to happen. And it did. I left the kitchen with my heart racing. My father was standing in the living room, looking at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. He opened his mouth to say something, but I was faster. "We're not going back." It was the first time in my life that I interrupted him. It was the first time I said something without waiting for his permission. The room fell silent. Nate appeared behind me. My father looked from one to the other, and then let out a dry laugh. "And how will you live?" My response was immediate. "Anyway, but how we lived there." His eyes glinted in a strange way, and for the first time, I noticed something I had never noticed before. He knew that one day this would happen. What happened next was something I never imagined. In the following days, while we stayed at Mrs. Parker's house, we discovered that the entire town began to comment on our escape. People whispered at corners, at the garage, at church. The neighbors began to look at my mother with more attention, and that's how something unexpected happened. My mother, who had always been trapped by fear, began to realize she wasn't alone. From the moment they knew what happened, some women in town began to approach her, Mrs. Parker mainly, and so, little by little, my mother began to free herself.
I want to pause for a moment. If you feel the love and are still listening to my story, please subscribe and hit the like button on the Grandparents Memories channel to show your support. Thank you so much.
She never had the courage to leave alone, but when she realized her children had left, she realized she had no more reason to stay. And so, on any given afternoon, she also left. When my father realized he was alone, it was too late. He tried to convince people that we had exaggerated. He tried to make my mother return, tried to say we were ungrateful, but no one listened anymore. For the first time in his life, he no longer had control over anything, and the man who always thought he would never need anyone ended up alone. Time passed. Nate and I managed to move on with our lives. It wasn't easy, but little by little we found our way. My mother also found a new way to live. She began to work, to support herself. And my father? Well, the last thing we heard was that he lost the garage, that he became a reclusive man, that he was no longer that respected mechanic. He learned too late that the fear he imposed for years didn't guarantee him anything in the end. Because when fear ends, what remains are the choices we made in life, and his led him exactly where he never wanted to be, alone. Not all freedom comes without marks. Some are conquered at a high price, and as much as we manage to move forward, the past always leaves traces. But what we do with these scars defines who we become. The day my mother left home was like the end of a lifelong storm. For so many years, Nate and I dreamed of leaving that invisible prison, but we never imagined our mother would have the strength to follow us. When we learned she had decided to leave, it was as if an immense weight had been lifted from our shoulders. But at the same time, we realized that freedom didn't mean an immediate happy ending. Life outside wasn't easy. We had nowhere to go, no money, no certainty of anything, just each other. And perhaps that was enough to start over. In the first days after the separation, we stayed at Mrs. Parker's house. She welcomed us without hesitation, without asking anything. My mother at first barely spoke. It was as if she were still processing everything, as if her mind were still trapped in a reality she was trying to escape. But with time, she began to react. She began to help Mrs. Parker at the library, began to go out more, talk with other women in town, began to realize she could exist without needing to ask permission. It was a slow process, but it happened, and for the first time, we saw our mother becoming her own person. Nate also changed. At first, I thought he would be lost, that all the pain he carried would still make him sink. But contrary to what I thought, he began to flourish. He returned to studying with more dedication. He began to spend hours at the town library, reading everything he could. And one day, after dreaming silently for so long, he said to me, "I'm going to be a teacher, Abby." It was as if the boy who drew birds had finally found his wings, and I knew he would fly high. But I I didn't know what I wanted to be. I just knew I wanted to live. And more than anything, I wanted to never again feel afraid to exist. So that day, we made a promise. We will never be like him, Nate said. Never, I repeated. It was a simple promise, but one that changed everything. One afternoon, while we were sitting in the backyard, my mother looked at us and said something I never expected to hear. Forgive me. Nate and I looked at each other. For what, Mom? I asked. She took a deep breath. For not protecting you. My heart tightened. Nate lowered his eyes. You did what you could, he murmured, but she shook her head. I should have done more. I should have left earlier. I knew she carried guilt, but I also knew it wasn't her fault because she too was a victim. And the most important thing was that now she was free. It wasn't until several years had elapsed that we received any information regarding our father. Reports indicated he remained solitary. His automotive business was struggling, and community perception of him had fundamentally shifted. Then, unexpectedly, a visitor arrived at our doorstep. Upon my mother answering, we beheld Robert Winters, though scarcely recognizable as the commanding mechanic and household autocrat from our memories. Time had diminished him physically. His once intimidating gaze now lacked its former intensity. What brings you here? My mother inquired directly. Drawing a measured breath, he responded, I've come to speak with you. She offered no verbal reply. Nate materialized at my side, equally silent. We had anticipated this confrontation for countless years, awaiting his acknowledgement of his transgressions. Yet when confronted with the actual moment, we discovered its significance had evaporated. His presence no longer held meaning in our lives. My mother declined to welcome him inside. Recognizing the futility of further communication, after an extended pause, he simply turned away and departed permanently. Time continued its progression. Nate fulfilled his long-standing ambition by entering the teaching profession. I discovered my own direction. My mother, despite the passage of decades, never reverted to the diminished figure from our early years. She uncovered within herself an unexpected resource, resilience, and collectively we endured, we liberated ourselves, though permanent impressions remained. Complete erasure of our experiences proves impossible. We cannot pretend to have emerged unaffected, yet we've developed methods of carrying these imprints without remaining captive to them. We relinquished the suffering, abandoned the dread, and ultimately, our emancipation constituted his greatest punishment. He faced death in isolation while we mastered the art of living. I have learned that not all wounds can fully heal, but we can learn to live with them. The scars of my past have become a part of me, but they no longer define who I am. I am no longer the little girl, Abby, who used to tremble at the sound of her father's footsteps. I am Abigail Winters, a woman who has found her voice and the strength to live the life she desires. Nate, my younger brother, has become the great teacher he always dreamed of being. My mother has learned to live again, finding joy in the simple things she was never allowed to embrace. And my father, he ended his life in solitude, a punishment he brought upon himself. I want to send this message to everyone. No one deserves to live in fear. No child should grow up without knowing love. And it is never too late to change your own story. Thank you for listening to my story. I am grateful to the Grandparents Memories channel for giving me the chance to share it. If my story can help even one person find the courage to change their life, then every pain I have endured has been worth it. If you find value in these stories, Please subscribe to Grandparents' Memories, like this video, and share it. Every story told can be a guiding light for someone lost in the darkness. I am Abigail Winters, and this is my story. Thank you for listening. See you in the next story on Grandparents' Memories.